This video looks at how molecules move across membranes, and the first way we're going to look at is diffusion. So diffusion is the movement of molecules from where there's a lot of them, a high concentration, to where there's not a lot of them, a low concentration. So in this diagram here, if you look on the right side, the solute, the molecule in the water, is represented by the red dots, and there's a lot more on the right side than there is on the left side. So it's going to move from the higher concentration on the right to the lower concentration on the left. On the other hand, in this diagram, because there's a higher concentration on the left and a lower concentration on the right, the molecules are going to move in the opposite direction. Now it should be noted, a couple of things should be noted, that the molecules have to be small enough to get through. Large molecules won't be able to squeeze in between through the pores that the membrane has in it. Think of when you filter something. So if you've got a sheet and you poured water into it, the water can get through and will come out the other side, but bits that are in the water will get stuck on the top of the sheet. Also, diffusion doesn't need a membrane. It'll occur anywhere. So if I put drops of squash into some water, the squash will spread out. Try it yourself, because it's moving from where there's a lot of it, a high concentration, to where there's not a lot of it, a low concentration. Diffusion will affect two things, or it will be diffusion can have two factors changed. Firstly, the speed can be changed, the speed of diffusion, and that's if there's a bigger difference in concentration. If there's a very big difference between the two concentrations, then particles will move faster. Whereas if they're close together, there's not much of a difference, then the particles will move more slowly. And the other thing, as we've seen, is the direction of the movement is affected. Because, as I said, it'll always move from where there's a high concentration to where there's a low concentration. So what if we want to go from where there's a low concentration to a high? What if we want to go in reverse? Well, this needs a process called active transport. Now what this diagram represents is these little blue particles here. That's the membrane. It's actually quite a thick layer made up of these two particles. Don't worry about the structure of it, you don't have to know that. But sitting in the membrane are these special proteins that act as pumps. So when we need to go from a low concentration, which is the top of this diagram, to the higher concentration at the bottom of this, what will happen is the protein pumps pick up the particles and pump them to the other side of the membrane. Now the only thing with this, it needs energy. So active transport uses up energy to pump molecules from where there's a low concentration to where there's a high concentration. Osmosis is the actual movement of the water molecules themselves. You've got to be careful with osmosis' definition, because if you said it's the movement of water from a high concentration to a low concentration, well, normally we'd be referring to the solute or the molecule in the water when we're talking about concentration. So the bits I've underlined here are things that you have to be careful with. It's the movement of water from an area of high water concentration to an area of low water concentration, from where there's a lot of the water particles to where there's not a lot of the water particles. Notice as well it says across a semi-permeable membrane. That basically means a membrane like the cell. But if it's not going across a membrane, then it's not osmosis. So osmosis is the movement of water from an area of where there's a high water concentration to where there's an area of low water concentration across the semi-permeable membrane. It's very important for cells, because if water is moving in and in and in, if it's an animal cell, well, that cell is going to burst eventually. So it has to control the movement of water. To do that, it controls the concentration of whatever's in it. We can look at experiments to do with diffusion or osmosis by using a special tubing called Viskin tubing, and it's just like, it looks like a thin plastic tube, but the special thing about it is that molecules, or small molecules, can pass through its sides. So we've got by here we've got a sugar solution in the beaker, and the viscous tubing tied at both ends is sitting in the water. Now what we'd expect to see is, because there's sugar, a lot of sugar in the water in the beaker, there's a higher concentration. So it's going to diffuse through the wall of the viscous tubing into the water inside, and the concentration inside should go up. So after a while, what we should start to see is sugar in the water inside the viscous tubing. Remember that if they're big particles, they can't get through the walls of the viscous tubing, just like they can't get through the cell membrane. So, what are the three forms of transport across a membrane? Diffusion is the movement of molecules from something concentration to a something concentration. What does active transport need to work? What is osmosis? And what can be used to demonstrate diffusion in the laboratory? So pause the video, see if you can get the answers. So, three forms of transport are diffusion, active transport, and osmosis. Diffusion is the movement of molecules from a high concentration to a low concentration. What does active transport need to work? Well, it needs energy. What is osmosis? Well, remember the two parts to it: the movement of water from an area of high water molecule concentration to an area of low water molecule concentration, and then adding through a semi-permeable membrane. And what can we use to demonstrate diffusion in the lab? Viscous tubing.